Okay, let's get started. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much. Thank you all for joining NOMAS to help celebrate Black History Month for our Cultural Memory and Black Identity panel. My name is Sasha Paul, and along with Lauren Brown, we are President and Vice President of the National Organization of Minority Architecture Students, and we will be leading today's discussion and panel.
Yes, as mentioned earlier, our panel is in collaboration and celebration, of Black History Month, which is celebrated all of February. This month honors the cultures, histories, and contributions of Black people to our American culture. During this month, we wish to highlight the works and contributions of Black identifying architects and designers to the architecture field. Tonight, we are joined by 3 UVA professors who have made significant contributions to the profession and to our community.
So our first panelist, Garnette Cadogan, is an essayist who is interested in the promise and perils of cities. Born and raised in Jamaica, Cadogan's work has led him to become a Harry Porter Jr. visiting professor at the University of Virginia School of Architecture, as well as a fellow at the Institute of Advanced Studies and Culture. Cadogan has also served as the Martin Luther King Jr. visiting professor at MIT's Department of Urban Studies and Planning, a visiting scholar at the Institute for Public Knowledge at NYU, and a senior critic in the sculpture department at the Yale School of Art. He is an editor-at-large for Nonstop Metropolis, a New York City atlas, and author of Walking While Black, in which he uses walking as a device to understand race, vulnerability, and cities in America.
Our second panelist, Mabel O. Wilson, is a Thomas Jefferson visiting professor at the University of Virginia. Wilson earned a Bachelor of Science in Architecture at UVA, a Master's in Architecture at Columbia University, and a Doctorate in American Studies at New York University. Most notable is her work on grounds as a designer and historian for the Memorial to Enslaved Laborers at UVA. Wilson is the co-founder of Studio And, an architecture firm focused on art, architecture, and cultural history. She is also the co-director of Global Africa Lab, as well as the co-founder of Who Builds Your Architecture, through which the connection between labor, architecture, and the global networks formed around architecture is examined. Wilson is a professor of architecture and African American Studies / African Diaspora Studies at Columbia University. Wilson's works include Negro Building, Black Americans in the World Affairs and Museums, Race and Modern Architecture, and Begin with the Past, Building the National Museum of African American History and Culture. Her teachings and publications center on the intersection of race, cultural memory, and the built environment.
Our last panelist, Elgin Cleckley, is an assistant professor of architecture and design thinking at the University of Virginia, with an appointment in the School of Education and Human Development, as well as the School of Nursing. Cleckley studied at the University of Virginia, earning a Bachelor's of Science in Architecture. He went on to earn his master's in architecture at Princeton University, and his most prominent work stems from his award-winning initiative, Pedagogy and Design Practice of Empathic Design. Cleckley's empathic design centers on building at the intersection of identity, culture, and memory. Before his role at UVA, his leadership at 3D Group based in Toronto led him to establish the Weston Family Innovative Center. Through his design thinking methodologies, the Science Museum features award-winning exhibitions, educational facilities, and public art from international artists. His book, Empathic Design, is set to release in 2021 with Island Press. And in this book, he details his empathic design principles.
We would like to thank all of our panelists for taking time out of their Friday afternoon to join us as part of this panel. Sasha and myself will serve as the moderators for this panel, asking a series of questions to prompt dialogue. We will begin with moderated questions, and in the latter portion of the meeting, we will open the floor to questions from the audience as we seek for this to be a larger conversation among the panelists in the audience. So our first question for our panelists is as follows. Identity is framed by where we are from. Where one is from can be interpreted as your hometown, ethnic background, family, and culture. Where are you from, and which people, places, and/or experiences got you to where you are today?
I can't tell you want to go first, Elgin. It's like we have that connection through our boxes, right? We just look at each other and smile. Sure. I'll go first. Well, first, I just wanted to thank Sasha and Lauren for everything that you do, for your leadership, your direction, and also for modeling the design futures for all of us to follow. So thank you so much for setting this up and all the work you've done to get us to this point. I'm from a small town called Orangeburg, South Carolina, population 14,000. My parents met each other there in primary school, and then they ended up dating through high school. Therefore, cue the music and also the movie script that could be written of that. But it was a space in a southern town in which I learned straight away the realities of race, culture, and cultural landscapes. It became a space where I understood from sacrifice, but also a space of identity and strength. Within that space, it was really an amazing moment to move, and we started to move heading on from there off to other parts of the US, to New York, to Atlanta, to California, to Mexico. But within all of it, I found that my parents were core design thinkers. The way they worked, they realized systems, they had aspired values that they met and achieved. One of the realities of that moving is that each place we landed in, I got to see the realities of the cities, the realities of race, culture, and design in the cities. But I also got to experience systematic racism in every school that we entered. I was one of the very few Black students who would enter a school. My mother and I had a code where I'd come home, send at the door. If I was placed in the wrong class, she would grab me, we'd go off to the principal's office. I'd be in a new course the next day. It became a reality that taught me through the navigation, watching my father take very big shifts in his life, also moving us around the country for advantages of his career and also moving us forward. But it became a series of experiences that really taught me an understanding of how to go forward and how to find strength in Black identity in ourselves and wherever we were.
Well, as you can guess, well, thank you first, Lauren and Sasha and Nomas. I joined Elgin in celebrating and affirming, not only leadership, but the kind of warmth and joy that you bring, even in the midst of, this Hollywood Squares moment that you bring, to the school and beyond. And as you can guess from my accent, I'm from Cuba. I'm from Jamaica, actually. Born and grew up in Kingston, and a place which so much life is lived with vibrancy on the streets. So I found myself deeply connected and anchored into those streets and the rhythms and the rhythms of interplay, with people that are there, and raised to be attuned to, life outside, life outdoors, to life, live publicly. And so it made, every bit of sense that New Orleans would be the place that I'd first enter and live in the US. And so I found myself connected to Kingston deeply, but also New Orleans, and becoming what people call like an interlocal, someone who, has a foot, rooted in more than one place, or see themselves as being from more than one place, and not so much transnational as an interlocal. That New Orleans is very, very much home in one sense. New York City is very, very much home, and Kingston is very, very much home. And so the streets of all three cities have shaped me, have, laid a claim to me emotionally, but also, had a big claim on me intellectually and socially. And so when people said, where are you from? I'm tempted to say, Kingston, New Orleans, and New York City.
Thank you so much. That is so beautiful. I definitely agree. Home is everywhere, and you bring home everywhere you go. So that is great. And our next question. So as students, we are bound to face moments of self-doubt in our involvement in the world in architecture. So was there a point in your career that you gained a sense of belonging to the architecture field, and feel free to describe a specific point of affirmation.
You can go first this time, Garnett. We have to switch back and forth. Mabel isn't.
Why don't I just embarrass Elgin? I think I'm going to embarrass Elgin. It's a good time to do that. And I'll answer that question by way of, Elgin had a great disadvantage of having had me as a housemate. So we're still working on a TV series, The Odd Couple, where he gets up and he begins his day at 4, where I end my day at 4 a.m. And having had him as a housemate has been one of the most richly affirming thing, just emotionally and spiritually, but also professionally. That having someone with not only merely to bounce ideas off, but who has this ability to summon your best self from you, who asks for your best self to show up in thinking about what it means to think about the built environment, to think about place and space and how they intersect, and what it might mean to make them more enriching by your work in them, by your reflections upon them, by your contribution to them, by just navigating and moving and being in them. What does it mean to think about presence and how presence animates and shapes architecture? Was richly affirming. And then, of course, the kind of doubts that you experience are the kind of doubts that are familiar to just about all of us at whatever stage we're at our career or at our lives. And so times when I felt like the imposter, moonlighting where it didn't belong. Because of course, as you begin first by saying I'm an essayist, and the nature of an essayist is to meander, is to wander, is to moonlight on places that supposedly is not their territory, but mere interest, the life of an amateur draws them there. And so Elgin was really important in affirming the value of being an amateur, of not undervaluing the kind of perspectives and the richness of vision that could come with that. But also at the same time would let me see that, okay, there are gaps and there are voids, but if you see yourself as not merely the lone figure making a contribution to architecture, but if you begin to see it like a community, as you should, and a community trying to make a contribution to communities, then all these gaps that are there are places where there are chasms in your own knowledge and your own understanding. A community will shuffle and draw close and huddle around you to begin helping to fill those gaps. That was important. So poor Elgin did not huge shock to be embarrassed today, but that's what old housemates do to you.
Thank you, Garnett. It's lovely. I really appreciate that. And it really speaks to the real importance, as well as what y'all are experiencing as students, is that sense of community and connection that helps you. And, I can't tell you how much Garnett's friendship has supported my thoughts, my actions, and my beliefs. I also believe it's one of those nice moments too, where the universe puts you in the right place at the right time, where you meet people that connect with you. It's that magical thing that happens when you're in school, when you're connecting, but also in friendship. And there's nothing I appreciate more. So thank you for that, Garnett. And I still am smiling about our comings and goings. That's perfect for the Netflix show that we still plan to do. But I also wanted to add that when I was the design coordinator for the Ontario Science Center, that was an experience that changed my entire perspective about these intersections. We designed for the entire world. I say that, and we worked with the idea of the population of Toronto, which is the world, but also produced designs for the world. And in that, the affirmations we got once we successfully connected, and the most powerful sentence ever was, "I see myself there in the institution." And that was really our goal. We really thought of everything we did, connecting on as many connections we could to different populations. And the idea was that you would find yourself not only in our public center, but also in all the interactives as well. And so that was a really moment that really meant a lot. And I would say that gave me the foundation to be a good friend for Garnett.
Thank you both so much for that. Like, going off of what you both are saying about one another, you both have been such like mentors and role models to both Sasha and myself and very many students here at the school. I always tell Professor Cleckley this, but he's actually one of the very reasons I'm even here at the school. From when I met him when I was in 11th grade when I came to tour UVA. So I thank him for that every single day. But I'm really curious to know for both you and Garnette, Professor Cleckley, were there mentors or role models that you guys had along the way, whether if it was in your youth, people that you looked up to, who you wanted to, that led you into the field of design and architecture, or even while you were in your own respective studies, like people or professors that you had, or even in the profession itself?
Thank you so much for that, Lauren. My students are teaching me new words, so you got me in my feels for a second, because I'm realizing that I keep forgetting that that was the connection there too. I think Lucia Finney for where I am today. Lucia Finney was the studio professor that changed everything for me. She created a safe, comfortable space in which we could find ourselves and also bring our full selves to our work. It was a kind of space too where we could be fully creative and really express ourselves through design. And I'm always appreciative to the space that was created. And it also created three professors who are here now from the same class and studio: Pankaj Virgupta, John Kamazi, and myself. Laura Wooten also is a very well-known artist here in town. I would say that I also look to what I learned in her studio and use it as a model in my studio as well, because I realized, wow, what an amazing way to set off a connection, to understand that all of your actions have later actions and can have longer impact. The diversity also of that studio really spoke to the goals that we're looking for as well, and created a space that really leads us to the future.
I came to design in a strange way. My interest in design and architecture. I came through an archivist and a historian in New Orleans. In New Orleans, there is, and there still is, the Hogan Jazz Archive, with which you can go, and so many of the most crucial voices in the history of New Orleans jazz and history of early jazz is there. And in New Orleans, it's a city, like Kingston, where so much culturally that is resonant happens in the street. It's where public space, and few cities in America it's like that, where public space is lived so vividly, so actively, so vibrantly, that on any given moment you open your door and there is a second line, as it were, the first line being the line of musicians, the second line being a line of celebrants or a line of mourners, or often in New Orleans, the two will fold and you're never exactly sure where the lament ends and the celebration begins. And so, you'll encounter second line, or you turn down an alley and then there's what they call the Mardi Gras Indians, Black Americans who are celebrating a connection with, and in a lineage, in a cultural, from indigenous populations that lived in Louisiana, in costumes, resplendent costumes that they'd spent a whole year making with these small beads, or you shift and turn somewhere else and there's a brass band having something again in the streets, or you turn again and there is a huge cookout with jambalaya in which everybody's invited. And so to be in New Orleans is to we continually hit with the question, what is place? What's an open public space? What's the public space in which many publics are intersecting and invited? But also, what does it mean to think about public space as contested in ways in which that activity on the street is a way of pushing against a history of discrimination, brutality, exclusion or marginalization in the city. And so much of it centers around or ties around music. That music is not just a way of organizing notes through time, but it's also a way of insisting on certain crucial and important things about identity, about belonging, about home. And so the archive was this collection of voices, but when you went and began exploring these voices, they were not merely voices about music, about the brass bands and about celebration and these variety of rich traditions in New Orleans. they were also in a collection of voices and stories about space, about the intersections of space and place and belonging and home and politics and the kind of resonances and dissonances that happened with them. And so the archivist there, Bruce Boyd Rayburn, his dad was Boyd Rayburn, one of the famous, band leaders in 20th century America, became not merely a guide, but this rich source of warmth and wisdom and wit and wondrousness, who began helping me to anchor myself in and ask, what does space mean? And how does design and how does the way we arrange ourselves in space and think about space and how the way we move through or are unable to move through space is very much not only a design issue but also an issue and about identity and how the two intersected. And so he became my introduction to the riches and multitudinous of New Orleans music, but also the riches and complexities and multitudinousness of space in that absolutely fascinating city, which has lived so much in the streets, and thereby, took me into thinking about design. So my drawing to the built environment actually came through the sounds and then the stories of musicians and helped, given context and made sense by Bruce.
That's great. I think, when it comes to spaces, how you said, like, they dictate so much of how we move and also how we interact with one another. And especially in this time of, diversity is at the forefront, and inclusion and equity is also at the forefront of our nation. I think the way that we design space is in our hands, and, we have so much more responsibility than we think as architects and designers. So I would like to welcome Professor Mabel O. Wilson. She is here today, and of course, we are glad to have her. And we just to start and introduce her, we'll have her answer where she's from and the moment she felt she belonged in architecture. So feel free to take it away. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Apologies for my lateness. I was on a dissertation defense. So it went over. It was a very good dissertation, actually. So we went a little bit over. So I had to basically switch now into a different kind of Zoom space. But it's great to see folks that I know here and new folks. So gosh, I mean, the question of where one is from is complicated. I'm from Jersey, and I'm proud of it. And I grew up in the Jersey Shore, but my parents were from the South, and so I spent a lot of time in coastal North Carolina with my grandparents, and the spaces of a Black community, of a creative family, ways in which, stories were being told through, what was being made, clothing, food, craft, the way, my grandfather would paint the garage and the back. My mom's parents lived in what was a shotgun that was doubled, so it was a double shotgun, and the sense of the sounds of the spaces of that house really made an impression on me. But I also, as a kid, I also grew up in Jersey. I mean, I grew up, kind of part of the New York metro area, and I had relatives in Newark and also in Harlem, and also thinking about those spaces of, for me, Black sociality, community, we're talking, late 60s, early 70s in terms of my formative experiences. and also growing up where I did, there was an urban uprising. And, what I remember of that kind of urbanity, why that happened, why we saw white flight of businesses from, for example, Asbury Park, like all of those things kind of inform my sense of place. And I would say my sense in entering architecture was I didn't see that in my architectural education. I always described myself as a vampire. Like I didn't sense like my grandparents' house and that culture in, I love the Villa Lante, but that was not my cultural experience. And so I have always had a very complicated relationship with architecture, both being one hand, 1 foot in, but also a sense of gazing always outward to the arts, to music, to, critical race theory, to all kinds of things that then I look through back into architecture to help me understand how to make a space of belonging. And I say belonging because I just think it's a process of always finding places, maybe not something that is static, but something that is evolving. Right. And I think of kind of Garnette's work in that way, in terms of like moving and what you encounter in moving. And that's why I would say belonging rather than belong in terms of like a specific like place.
No, I think that all of that's like super interesting and very exciting to hear. I know one thing that stood out to me is when you're talking about like your understanding of like architecture and the built environment, both in the South and in the North. I know Professor Cleckley touched on like him being from the South and also his experiences in the North as well. And we took a studio last semester that was talking about the Great Migration and like these larger dialogues. So I'm curious to learn more about maybe like if there were any cross paths between like all of you guys like as panelists, like in terms of like your occupancy like in the South and in the North, but also just like in life, like other times you guys may have met and things like that.
I could speak to what happened to us every summer. My parents would put us on a Greyhound bus, packed up, and send us back to South Carolina no matter where we were. And it became a way to remind us about our past. And my grandmother lived in a trailer on the remnants of an old plantation. And so imagine you get there as a kid and you'd look out and you'd see the rows of cotton kind of still remaining in the distance, and then these structures that were there on the site. And it's interesting now when I look back and my interests, how I keep remembering how I would explore those spaces with my brother. And it became a way to understand the past and also try to fill in the blanks. And this idea about craft also too is really, really powerful in that, I'd see my grandmother making quilts, and those quilts became a really great empathic device of material. And pointing at each material then would lead to a story, and then you'd find out something even more. It made really difficult narratives were told instantly. It made patches then became these moments of design that really spoke. And so therefore, when we returned back, you really had a sense of pride and you had a remembrance, and it was purposeful. And at the time, I remember being really agitated about my parents sending us there. But then as time went on, I saw, oh, this is it. This is part of an understanding of who you are. Kind of back to that first question of where you are and how you can take that to remind yourself and to be part of that as in your Black identity within as you operate through and navigate in the world.
I'm waiting for Garnette to jump in.
And I was waiting on you.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, I think, the question of crossing paths and returns are always important. What I feel like I've been really fortunate to have in my life has been great interlocutors, some of whom become collaborators. that helped me, kind of think through, influence my work, and continue to kind of inspire. I met Garnette actually a few years ago. Actually, I think it's through Rebecca Solnit, right? I think I met you at Rebecca's event in New York City around the New York Atlas. And Rebecca's somebody I know from the Bay Area. And so, and her work is phenomenal. I think it's called Rivers of Shadow. Her book on Muybridge is really fantastic. And so kind of thinking about writers and writers who address geographies, and which is something that Garnette does. Just having those dialogues with folks are really important. But I have to say that, the kind of early dialogues around architecture were always with my classmates, right? And one of my business partners, in a practice I had, KWA, I was the person who sat behind me at UVA, Paul Carrier, who he's a professor at Carleton doing beautiful work, but Paul would just bug me endlessly. Turn around, look at my work, and we became really great friends. And eventually, kind of down the road, we set up a practice. And when I do my talk, I'll talk about some of the things that we did, like the Away Station and other work, but he nonetheless became a very important interlocutor and collaborator. And I've just been fortunate to be able to have that community as I've gone along, and I think that's been very impactful. But I would just say that sense of community, again, kind of comes from kind of where and how I grew up, with, friends constantly going in and out of the house, that my parents always made sure that there was a broader community in which we were situated. And that is something I've sought to maybe replicate, I think, both in my personal and professional life.
And for me, that theme is at the heart of how I've developed and how the conversations have happened, with community. That I feel, in so many ways, I was raised by community in Kingston, and then I went to New Orleans and met community rather than one person, and then it was community who then prepared me back for community again in New York City. And it has been a bunch of intersections with these different communities, but I feel that the return keeps happening, and if not even bodily, but a return through works. And I think of even my intersection with Mabel, who I'd met on the page before meeting in person, and so you return, and so the sense that you're intersecting, or you're crossing paths again. You felt like you kept crossing these paths on the page, but also because the conversation wasn't a conversation Mabel was having alone. Mabel was having this conversation with a matrix of other people. So I think, for example, of my dear friend Farah Griffin, who's also a friend of Mabel, and so sometimes I'd be in conversation with Farah, who had been in conversation with a long time, or my friend Brent Edwards, my pal, Baba Mealy. These are all people who are having conversations about what does it mean to think about Black cultural production, and also Black cultural production that is happening within spaces that often would try to mitigate against them. How did they carve out their space? How did they see a space, see a vision, imagine themselves in spaces, almost like by the sheer imagination, projected not only visions of what it could be, but actually projected and created in a real spaces, in a cultural spaces, within the built environment. And so to be having those conversations was to continually be in conversation with Mabel, even if she wasn't there physically. And so what it meant then to suddenly begin to understand presence in a much broader way, that there is the presence of the actual person you're in conversation with, but there's a particular presence with how the person continually intersected with the lives of others in your community, intersected and was in conversation with work that you were in conversation with, and to suddenly recognize that you kept returning to that person, you return to that presence on the page, the way we each began to contain the other. And some my return to to these places, that there's the return time and again to Kingston or to New Orleans, and suddenly having a richer sense, of what it meant to think about space, because those are new spaces. And then, going back and meeting back the old maps and recognizing how much those old maps had shaped me, and how those old maps were being reshaped by the new places that I was in. That to be in a place and to start orienting yourself is to suddenly have one map sorted onto you, trying to adjust or even genuflect to the new map that you're encountering. But then also to recognize, how much the crossing of paths, kept happening in the context of community. How, various voices, stories, presences, would, be, part of that community in multiple different spheres. So I could be talking to a literary scholar like Farah. I could be, talking, someone who, deals with music, like say, Vijay Ayo. I could be, discussing, in a community, in engagement and development, with Caesar McDowell, and there it was, I was meeting Mabel again and crossing paths with her. And then of course, we'd also cross paths and bringing the new year together, literally sitting beside each other and, bringing in a new year a couple of years ago. And so, those paths kept crossing until, now I don't even think the paths cross, anymore, as much as like, we're friends in which our paths are bound up with each other.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny you bring up Farah, because I encountered Farah through her book, Who Set You Flowing? And Paul and I read, that book and poured over it and the narratives, and it was partially inspiration for our project, A Way Station. And I knew Farah by her work and her writings before, she became a friend and a colleague. So yeah, these are important comings and goings, I think.
I think there's something truly beautiful and wonderful about, the idea of crossing paths, and, it's not just a cycle of you coming back to the same thing, but there is this continuation of some things evolving in this one space. And I just want to ask, how do we design these cultural narratives when the construction of false narratives are quite prevalent in our built environment?
Lucille Clifton, a wonderful poet, who, even though she's no longer with us anymore, it feels as if she's still very much with us. Used to have an expression, I hope I'm remembering it right, in which she'd say, they can call you by that name. It doesn't mean you have to answer to it. And so the way to think about it, I think, is, Lucille's, advice that they can call you by that name. They can, prescribe roles for you, try to overdetermine, how you're seen, or, what you need to do. But then your own imagination, your own sense, of self, of community, of what it means to inscribe, that very self, with all its, propensities and possibilities, is ultimately what, all to determine, how you, you make, your way in the world. Not to say that, the, restrictions, can't be, formative, but what, is still ultimately formative in how to begin to think about, the design, is then to begin to ask, what are the possibilities of my imagination? What are the possibilities, especially, all three of us have been speaking about community. And it's not coincidental that it's not the Horatio Alger story that, just by yourself and by sheer force of will, you'll make it through. All of these structures, are designed in such a way that it's almost here to like frustrate, to undermine, to sometimes, force itself upon and defeat, the individual. And so community, that's why, time and time again, you keep hearing the expression Black joy. And, I think those on the outside of it, might think of it as a kind of self-help mantra, but it's a miss the nature of joy. That joy by nature is, joy by nature, is expansive. It rises in amplitude in company. So to think about Black joy is not, one person must turn up in a confidence in the midst of things, but it's to recognize how much tying with community, anchoring yourself in other people, in a coalitions, working together, imagining together, thinking together, crossing paths, but also recognizing crossing those paths, those intersections become productive because I see yourself deeply connected in each other and each carrying the other. Suddenly then gives imagination, in a rich terrain with which to roam, rich terrain with which to create, rich terrain with which to begin to imagine, other futures and alternate futures. And so I think, for example, of the growing interest in, understandably so, Afrofuturism. And part of that is coming from an understanding that to think about the future, to think about what it means to project the imagination across space, across the environment, is to begin to think and to ask, what does it mean to work together in community? What does it mean to have, as I've spoken, what Elgin had done with me, finding ways to summon my best self. What does it mean to actually have community? Summon your best self, and your best self also to be in the service of and in partnership with, in lockstep with community. And so my answer then is, again, community, rooting oneself in something larger, into a group that is bigger, and then to also, keep remembering Lucille Clifton's advice. They can call you by that name, but it doesn't mean you have to answer to it. That imagination, given rich, fertile ground, with the support and the coalition that comes, from togetherness, can, do marvelous and wondrous things.
Just thinking about the idea of community and also the connection of community for the insertion of the John Henry James Memorial here in Court Square. The only reason I found out about it was through the beautiful community of activism, designers, and citizens, students, leadership, government, placing the site designed for the body column and also the marker from the Equal Justice Initiative from the National Memorial for Peace and Justice in Montgomery. Siri Russell, we're thankful to, and Barbara Brown Wilson connected me, the idea of the community that's existed to support as well. But thinking about the work of Dr. Andrew Douglas and Dr. Jelaine Schmidt as well in the space. John Henry James was lynched just west of town at Farmington Country Club, just in front of Farmington Country Club in July of 1898, July the 12th, falsely accused of assaulting Julia Hotop up at Penn Park. If you go up to Penn Park, you can actually find where the old house was. The project was really something that I was really fortunate to work with and connect with. And it goes back to this idea of the previous question of these connections, where all of a sudden you start to work on something and you see that it's a larger story. It's almost like you're a patch in a quilt. But the idea of the design was really based on all the connections and conversations with all that have done this amazing community work to shift the narrative in this public space. Plus, there's the idea of truly making the space a public space. How do you then design and connect this narrative in a space in the shadow of then two Confederate statues? Nothing became more surreal than the work on a project such as that, to set this in the space, to think about the actual positions from that point that connected to Monticello, the Monticello Hotel, the Number Nothing building, where the slave market existed. Thinking back to the courthouse itself, the activities that happened on the site and the history and background of the various statues that are there, but to look at the site now as it's evolving and changing, and the removal of the At Ready statue there in September. Garnette's talking about, was speaking to this idea of that community connection, and it's really says something about the shifting the narrative of this idea of the force of us all working together in a direction. I think that's part of it as well. It's rethinking, redesign thinking, but imagining that these memories you have from your background and your history now become parts of talking about a new idea of cultural heritage and cultural connection.
I think it's a really great question, and thanks, Elgin, for bringing that up. I was there the day the EJI placed the marker. It was really powerful. I can't remember the name of the woman who told the story of what happened to John Henry James, but she just said, imagine you're the wife, mother, daughter, grandmother, and you can't find this person. You don't know where they are, what happened to them, and you cannot go to the police, right? Because you probably know they are complicit in whatever happened to them. And she just said, like, what does it mean to live under that sense of fear and also terror, right? That racial violence enacts, because that is the violence that's necessary to keep you literally in your place economically, in your place socially, and in your place physically. The searing truth of that story was, it was like it just sliced through the reality, that, or I would say the mythos that is often woven around American nationalism and American identity. And I feel that some of those stories really have to be reckoned with in terms of the reality of what is America. I'm doing organizing a kind of conversation literally called This Is America, because I run the Institute for Research in African American Studies at Columbia. And it's just called This Is America. And it's with Jelani Cobb, Farah Griffin, Deva Woodley, who's a great political scientist, and Robin Kelly, to really talk about, like, when Joe Biden said, this isn't who we are, it's like, this actually is who we are. And I think that part of that mythology is also liberal individualism, right? The weight that we put on individual rights and our singularity negates the real dependencies that we have on others and our accountability, our ethical accountability to others. And for me, that's why collectivity and community is so important, right? Because I think the myth of individualism it's toxic. I mean, I love asking my students, and I think I did this with my students this semester by UVA. It's like, if you're sitting in your room, do you know anyone who has made anything that is in the room? I don't know who made this glass. I can tell you who the designer is for these earrings, but I don't know who made that, right? Like, we're so disconnected, right, from the things that make our life possible and in the kind of material sense. So why couldn't the person who made this actually have clean water and a place to live? Like, why can't we build a world, right, that is accountable to others, and not just that, I got my land, I got my McMansion, my fence, my car, my whatever, without realizing the only way you have them is in reciprocal relationships to those of others. And I feel, that kind of some of the mythos of the nation and then of our respective communities really, I think, need to be challenged or recalibrated to think about the importance of collectivity and how we make spaces that enable everyone's life to really have that equality, right, and equity that we strive for. And that's that story. That's the John Henry James, like the feeling like, I don't have an equal access. I don't have that right. I can't go to the police and say what happened to my husband or my father or whomever, right? Because that's been robbed, right? You are not yet citizen. You are not yet human, for that matter. And I think we have to recognize that is a reality, and and we have to somehow work to recalibrate the systems, right, that make our lives, collective lives, possible.
Thank you all so much for all of that. That was honestly, like, there's so many points to like talk off of that based off of community, because it's just such a dense idea to begin thinking about. But I think the idea of community is something that needs to be discussed a lot more within our own discipline, especially like how we can serve the community, but more importantly, how we can learn from the community in our discipline. But we want to begin to open this up to the rest of the audience to ask questions. You're welcome to unmute yourselves, but you can also put questions in the chat, and Omar will read them aloud and to our panelists here. But yeah, so I will open it up for any questions if anyone wants to prompt our panelists.
Oh, I see Brendan has a question.
Go ahead, go ahead.
Cool, thank you, Omar. First of all, thank you, Professor Cleckley, Professor Cadogan, and Professor Wilson for being here. Professor Wilson, you just said something interesting about, that myth of individualism. And I'm curious, you all as Black designers, how you've navigated this profession, with your individualism in your work when Blackness in America is often perceived as a monolith.
I mean, yeah, no, thank you, Brandon. I mean, I think that's a really great question. And yeah, like how do you navigate it? I mean, I have to say I've been, I would describe myself as being very undisciplined and quite unruly in terms of being willing to, like I said, move outside in order to maybe gather the things that I need in order to sort of maybe build, like recognizing maybe very early on that my architectural education would give me one set of skills, but I also needed a whole other set of skills maybe to even think through, accomplish, make, build, references, and so forth. And so, I would say that my my practice is very much like that. And I would just say, like, the projects that I work on, are always collaborative and collective. Like I'm realizing how much that's, even though it seems intuitive, I think it's been intuitive, but I think it's just been essential to, kind of how I work. There was a really great piece on the show that I've curated that opens tomorrow at the Museum of Modern Art. It's a really great piece in the Architect's newspaper by Jess Myers. And she talked about, like how the show, it's called Reconstructions, Architecture and Blackness in America. And it's interesting because the group of architects, designers, and artists, there are 11 people in the show. 10 of them, who are really the designer group, formed a collective, the Black Reconstruction Collective. And so rather than seeing themselves as, let's say, LLC architecture competitors, right? Even though some of them, have practices in that sense, rather they saw themselves as a kind of collective that then could leverage that collectivity to do additional work, to engage in a set of issues, and it's been really fascinating to watch that form. But that was also part of our curatorial practice. We put together an extraordinary advisory panel to be our kind of think tank, to be our archive, to be the thing that we couldn't get at MoMA, which was like a conversation around anti-Black racism and Blackness. So we formed a collective in order to even just curate the show. And so it's been interesting to think about, like, just in that one project, like why that was so important, right? As a project of both exchange, but also like conviviality, of like just a way of finding almost a space of joy and laughter. Because like our advisory board meetings, we would always, and this was in my insistence, it's like, no, we're not going to a restaurant in Midtown. Let's go to a Black business in Harlem, right? And give MoMA's money to that business. And they'd be these amazing meals of, like, we'd start drinking, and at one point we end up dancing at another restaurant. Like, that conviviality helps work through the difficult conversations around the violence, what we just talked about, like John Henry James, right? Because you have to balance that with a kind of care. And I think the community enables that kind of both psychic care that is necessary to engage, I think, the violence, right? That racialization enacts, I think, in everyday life and also in professional life.
Go ahead, Garnett. I'm still thinking.
I know Garnette has great things to say about care.
Exactly. Right? I mean, Garnett, we were roommates, so I know how you are about care. That's episode 4 of our show.
I was trying to outthink, not in terms of quality, in terms of the time, Elgin, but yes, I lost this face off. One of the things I was thinking about is the kind of structures that exist to deal with some of these things, the kind of mutual aid structures. So I spoke about New Orleans earlier, and I think of all these Mardi Gras Indians that we see in the streets, and the brass bands, and the active life in public, are also products of and creators of structures of care in the social aid societies, in which when the city and state and country federal government has failed them, that they have to create a variety of structures with which rooted in community, rooted in a sense that we each carry the other, we each bear the marks of the other, we're each containing the other, that they then had to fill in, or try to begin to fill these spaces caused by neglect, caused by active brutality by way of policies, or just actual brutality of police in the streets. And so to think about then the structures is to think about these structures of care, these mutual aid societies, which themselves are ways of centering care and putting care in the middle of it all. And this is not just New Orleans. This is not just New Orleans. Think of work, who I know is also a friend of Mabel, and a friend of mine, Sadia Hartman, and her marvelous book, her last book, Wayward Lives. What's the second half of Wayward Lives again, Mabel? Wayward Lives. Okay, Mabel's grabbing it from the shelf. But in which she speaks of just city after city after city, and whole structures of care that had to exist that had to come. Wayward Lives, beautiful experiments, exactly, and that's exactly what it is. These beautiful experiments, and there are experiments in care and mutual aid, which were structures of care that had to emerge because of neglect or opposition. Often in quiet spaces, in dark spaces, that what you were seeing there in public were often the product of a lot of structures of care that were happening in private. What does it mean, for example, to think of in a queer club as a structure of care, in a way of having a mutual aid society because of existing laws and norms which exclude you, which oppress you, which brutalize you. And so to then begin to think about answering your question, Brendan, is then begin to think about asking, what does it mean to think about care and care outside of the official and mandated lanes, in a care in the quiet places, in the hidden places, in the hidden spaces, and care which itself is coming out of mutual aid structures. So as Mabel rightly said, to begin to answer this is to begin to think about care, and to begin to ask how does care intersect with race, intersect with architecture, and how does it emerge from not only the hidden city, the unofficial city, but also how it informs the official and the seen city.
Thanks for your question, Brandon. I was thinking about sharing a bit about a project I'm working on down in Lynchburg, the Jefferson Park, which is amazingly right next to where Lauren went to elementary school in Darrington and Jefferson Park. There's a pool there in the park, which was filled to basically stop it being desegregated by segregation times. And the idea of it was filled with at first trash, and then Christmas trees, and then capped over. And right next to it is a series of housing. And part of scheduling some design thinking workshops there on the site. And it was one of those projects where all of a sudden you realize that you've entered this space of care and community. It was, we had a recent design thinking workshop, which was in the tennis courts, which were at the top of this park. And we were there, and it was open to the entire community. And this was probably workshop number 3 or 4, if I trace it right. I remember being there and realizing that we were conscious about the timing of it, made sure it was on a Saturday. There was childcare. There was even a play space in the corner. And we blew up everything to large scale so that we could actually design together, look at the park and think about all the new attractions that could go within the park. This was all guided by the City of Lynchburg's planning department. We set up this entire system of care to make sure and connect with all the residents that are there. Right before we even walked around kind of down the side streets and said, hey, there's a workshop going on. Oh, and there's lunch there too, so come on up. At the end of it, there's a brand new plan now for the park, and now the city is planning to do right by its citizens and restructure the park and area, even improving sidewalks, streetscapes, signage. It's a really great moment to, again, it goes back to this idea of the community that sets and works together, but it's a real message to think about how do we shift now that we're really understanding what's necessary for the future. In it too, as a designer, it really taught me a lot about your own personal humility, how you see yourself in this space, how you see yourself as a facilitator when you pull forward, when you come pull back, and also how you're respectful and you create a comfortable space where everyone feels included. Plus, there's really nothing better than to see the shift from what was then to now and what could be possible for the future.
I'd like to answer it, if I could, in part with just because there's sometimes a temptation to think that all this talk about collective and care, is either too abstract or it seems so much beyond reach, and I'm conscious that, we're here in conversation, with NOMAS, who's been working really hard to, show, fellow students in an institution possibilities, and what those possibilities could look like, and imagine it could look like, within reach. And so I wanted to just show something.
One day I was just around the back of my yard doing some chores, and I heard a lot of noise. And I went to my gate to look to see what it was, and I saw children running up and down wild. A lot of kids, some riding bicycles, others playing different games. And I was like, wow, and this was school time. I know that if it wasn't for COVID, they would have been in class. So as a teacher, I took responsibility. I felt responsible because I was like, because we're not able to be with them, they're out there doing that. And I felt sad. And I knew that I had to do something about it. Then the thought came to paint blackboards in this community, put up the work at a designated spot, and let parents know. So everybody can just come and access it. Take their phone, take a picture, and take it back inside their room for their children. And that's what I did.
Early every morning, Mrs. McCoy Phipps and her assistants go to different communities where they religiously write the day's lesson on the community blackboard. The devout teacher says the COVID-19 pandemic has only increased her resolve to reach as many students as possible.
No, it's called for teachers to be critical thinkers and proactive. And I can't let my children down. It doesn't matter if they're not members of my class. I just know definitely that I am responsible for the nation's children, so I'll have to do something about it. Behind every zinc fence and board lies a lot of children with great potential and ability. Equal access to education. You don't know where these great children are. You just have to make sure that nobody's left behind. Hold their hands and bring them. Every child can learn. Every child must learn.
So because I'm asking the imagination to reach far and wide, it doesn't necessarily mean that the design itself, has to, need to reach far and wide. The resources can be small, but it's remarkable with just, rooted in community and working together with community at the forefront, and even with small amount of resources, just how remarkable it can, and what design can look like, and what the structures of care can look like in simple yet powerful and potent ways.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to add maybe to what Garnette just shared with us, which I thought was really remarkable. And I know a lot of y'all are students of architecture and you're learning the discipline. But the reason I say being undisciplined is that you can take your architectural education and do actually a great deal with it. Like, you can make space, you can build, there's a lot that you can do that's not, kind of within the confines of what we might understand, both the discipline and the profession. I'm going to share with you a link to one of my care communities, somebody I talk to almost weekly with another friend who's a poet. And it's our care group. We call each other and we just thought, like, what has driven you crazy this week? And it's great. I mean, we're 3 Black women. We have our various artistic practices. The reason I know Veronica was, again, she was a classmate at UVA. She was in my class at the A school. And so we both have an architecture education. She went and she worked for architects, then lighting architects. She worked for George Sexton. Then she worked in exhibition design, and for many years had her own exhibition design practice in Washington, D.C., doing work for the Smithsonian, the National Archive. I mean, she had a very visible practice and doing extraordinary work, but wanted to tell her story, wanted to, like, not narrate for these big institutions, but what is my story as a Black woman, and the spaces that I experienced, where I grew up, my family story. She went and did a visual critical studies degree at California College of the Arts, and just decided, I'm gonna think about these spaces, these places through an artistic practice, right? And this was a show she had in Charlottesville, actually, or I think in Lynchburg, but she's actually shown her work in Charlottesville as well. And she's really incredible thinker, but I think that her architecture background really gave her a kind of foundation for thinking about place and space and family and community, and also just a sense of making that she's translated into this rich practice. I mean, she still works, does exhibition design and various kinds of projects, but she draws on her training as an architect to think about and work through Blackness in the built environment, particularly from a kind of Black feminist perspective.
Work is marvelous.
Yeah, it's worth checking out. She's really phenomenal.
So we have time for about 1 or 2 more questions. So.
Yeah, we have a question from Gabriel Andrade, who asks, what are the leads in your teaching approaches when it comes to specifically identity?
Can you say that once more, Amir? I'm sorry.
Oh, yeah. What are the leads in your teaching approaches when it comes to identity specifically?
I'm not sure their leads, or maybe I'm misunderstanding the question. I'm not sure their leads so much as I like to think when I'm thinking about identity, because identity, properly understood is really a polyphony. In teaching, I also think of, it's not so much as leads as much a polyphony of voices. That part of the problem that we're recognizing increasingly, it's not that it's new, but we're being made aware of it even more. And that's, for example, that marvelous exhibition that Mabel I'm saying marvelous today. I haven't seen it, but I've gotten glimpses and it's anticipations of it for reconstructions. But it's also people whose work I absolutely love. But at least one of the marvelousness promised by it is the polyphony of voices. It's how identity as a polyphony in the many different stories, the many different voices, the many perspectives, the promise of multitudinousness versus the monolith, to go back to that word that Brandon speaks of. So in teaching and teaching about identity, I'm reminded of Baldwin's remark once where he said that I'm not here to try to explain Black people to people who are white. I'm not here to explain Blackness to whiteness. I'm here to explain how we all contain the other. And so you can't degrade people who are Black without degrading your very selves. In an observation which has been made since time immemorial, you just grab from a bookshelf quickly, and it's like it's there in Harriet Jacobs, it's there in Frederick Douglass, that in degrading people because of their identity, there's no way to do to degrading yourself. And then so to teach identity properly, the leads really is to recognize how much we are all bound up with each other, and how each of us in ourselves are bound up with many different perspectives. How identity itself is this deeply complex, multi-layered thing. It's almost as a foster record with many different grooves underneath, in a bunch of bugs, a bunch of stuff that comes running out that would wish wouldn't be seen, but also a lot of beautiful grooves and lines and pathways. And so how I teach it then is to begin to invite people to see the polyphony, to invite people to move away from the single voice or the two or three voices, to invite them to move away from the saying, oh, we're just going to look at Mabel's voice, or we're going to pick up race and architecture, which that book itself, it's a marvelous book, but the book also makes clear that this is an invitation, along with a provocation, and not exhaustive. This itself is a polyphony, and each essay there is trying to bring you and invite you to hear the polyphony. And so that informs very much my teaching approach, the voices, the perspectives, but also the approach in the pedagogy, that he who knows only architecture doesn't know architecture. That it means to properly understand architecture, it means it's a polyphonic conversation. It means you have to begin to understand the sociologists, and the historians and the ethnomusicologists and the philosophers. But it also means understanding activists, understanding community workers. It means also remembering the man at Chi Hall Station. I'm not sure if you know that story by Ralph Ellison, where it's this man going around giving lectures on jazz. This white professor, I think he's from Columbia, if I remember correctly, and he's going around giving lecture place after place after place, and he's like, oh, he's the expert, the voice. And he's going home one day and coming down the subway, and this man who just cleans the subway station, if I remember the story right, I haven't read it in a couple of years, pretty much said, they don't know what I know. And in other words, he said, I know that you're telling out, you're sending out the BS, and they can't call you out because they're only seeing the one story, but I am there and I know. And every time after that, the professor went to give a talk, he kept looking to the back of the room, worried that the man from Chi Hall Station was going to come and ask a question and expose him. And so I also teach the class remembering myself, like, okay, what if the man from Chi Hall Station comes in? That perspective that's not seen, that perspective that's not paid attention to. So in other words, to invite the man from Chi Hall Station to have the multiple voices, the multiple perspectives, but also with awareness and the recognition that there's much that they don't know, but that someone could step in a way that they wouldn't feel that they need to call me to account as much as they would feel the rich invitation to fill in the gaps in what isn't known. And so therefore that's my pedagogy, not to find a lead so much as to throw in relief the richness of a chorus. So in other words, Baldwin is going to be having conversations with Amanda Williams, who's going to be having conversations with Mabel Wilson, who's going to be having conversations with Toni Morrison and Lucille Clifton and Tom Segru, and Stevie Wonder, and A Tribe Called Quest, and Alice Shepherd, dance, and.
Do you want to take a stab, Elgin?
Sure. I was thinking, what Garnette, you were talking about being bound up. I have a quote on my computer now from the UN Decade of Women Conference in 1985, when Lila Watson and the Queensland Aboriginal Activist Group declared, "If you've come here to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you've come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together." And it made me think about the past studio I had. It's hard not to think about past studio when I see so many students in the past studio. We spent so much time together connecting with each other. And in it, we were bound up together. And I feel, first of all, I think about it almost on a weekly basis, the community we had together. And I know it's because everybody was there and everyone brought themselves and everyone was honest and we were all honest and connected with each other, because we really took this idea of the time and space we have together as a space to develop, learn about each other, and imagine other lives. And the vehicle for that was Isabel Wilkerson's The Warmth of Other Suns. It provided us with an incredible entryway where we could see ourselves, think about our own connections, our own generations, but it also became a real pivotal moment for us to think about responses in design. So you can look around cities and realize the response of the story, the migration story, and what we created. That idea of being bound together is the basis of my pedagogy and how I teach, and the idea of this empathy then that grows as we connect and learn from each other. For isn't that the goal of education, I think? Isn't that the goal of how we operate, I think? Isn't that the idea of a democratic space, I think? But I think we think is really the idea there, and how we operate together then becomes a way to think about designing for the future.
Yeah, I mean, I will only add, I think, to Elgin and Garnette's eloquent answers, is I absolutely agree with Elgin's point about dialogue. As a teacher, I mean, I think, kind of my point of bringing up, a couple of my UVA classmates is the sense that you will actually learn a lot from your classmates, your peers, in the conversations that you have. And I enjoy teaching because I learn a lot from my students. I mean, that's why, I'm coming from this dissertation defense, because I just learned a hell of a lot about New York infrastructure and, its history. And it's in part about imparting knowledge, I mean, as a teacher, but we don't know it all. And in fact, we learn a lot from the dialogues that we have, in our respective spaces, whether studios or seminars or lectures. I teach a architectural history survey course that about 5 years ago, we actually turned it kind of into a seminar. It's the required master's level survey that for many years, both Ken Frampton taught one, Mary McLeod taught the other. And we decided to take that class and then split it into 3 sections. So those, instead of 90, you're in a class with 30, so that we could actually have a dialogue about what we were reading, and to sort of unpack and question these kinds of received histories. And I teach the first 19th century architectural history. And, the second class usually is around race and nation, right? Which is to kind of frame that as kind of essential to modern, the development of modern architecture, or modernity more broadly. It's to understand the emergence of racial difference and those power hierarchies, this question of identity, but also nationalism, which is another form of collective identity and power relation, right? And so by having that as a seminar, it opens it up more so to kind of a dialogue between, you know, myself and the students, right? And I think that that dimension of teaching has always been incredibly important to me. And sometimes that dialogue sort of continues onto other projects. Like, for example, I mean, I'm going to give a talk in April about who builds your architecture. And that was myself, a colleague, and Barnard Kadambari Bakshi, and a number of the students that I had either in studio or as PhD students who formed that, again, collaborative. We're a collective, an advocacy project. And so, you know, those dialogues can continue even, you know, outside of the classroom. And I think that's important to recognize.
No, thank you all so much for the questions and also the responses to everything. This conversation has truly been amazing. I know we're starting to get to the end of the panel, so we'll go ahead and conclude. But again, we want to thank all of our panelists, Professors Garnette, Cadogan, Elgin, Cleckley, Mabel Wilson, for engaging in conversation with us, but most importantly, taking time out of your extremely, extremely busy schedules to spend time with us this evening. So again, our gratitude on behalf of NOMAS and the school as well. I want to say that while this lecture was one not focused on the formalities and pedagogies of theory and architecture, it was one focused on the self. And before we are architects, architecture historians, or landscape architects or planners, we are individuals. We are all shaped by our experiences in the world around us. This conversation sheds light on the symbiotic relationship between our identity, the world, and our built environment. The important part of our discipline is to design for others, grounded in designing for others who cannot do so without understanding each other's backgrounds and our differences. As we celebrate Black History Month, we must take time to understand the intricate relationship our discipline has with Black identity. Architecture, both in pedagogy and the spaces we occupy daily, has shaped the experience of being Black in America. Likewise, the identity of being Black in America shapes how we are perceived in and occupy the stores, parks, homes, and other architectures we encounter every single day.
Thank you so much, Lauren. Yeah, and I definitely agree. Our panelists have really shared that it is a journey to bridge identity, you know, your personal identity with the world, and being confident in your own identity doesn't always equate to, you know, society having a mutual acceptance of that identity. So time and time again, we've seen that Black history shows us that there's a gap between self-acceptance of our identity and social acceptance in the architecture field. But yet through these trials, we have seen that your identity is not meant to be a burden at all. It's rather a collection of experiences that really continue to inspire us. And such inspiration is what leads to great success. So looking back on the entire month through our initiatives, such as our 100 Black Voices, our voice is, it's really important to understand that, you know, we all have voice, and we all, you know, have this narrative. And although a narrative comes from, you know, one person and one voice, all of our voices are connected to where we come from. So, and that pretty much just brings us back to our first question, where are you from? So now that we've come full circle, I want to thank you all for joining us this evening. This panel brings an end to our celebration of Black History Month, but as you've heard today, you know, it's important to continue to bring cultural memory and identity into your design work beyond Black History Month. So go out and design with empathy, and design with a narrative, and design with care, and enjoy your evening. Thank you.